trade call. This is a live session that I'm putting together today. And I want you to know that when I was thinking about the date, sorry about that, kicked the table. When I was thinking about the date, I really wanted to do something in November, but I was worried that with the G20 meeting coming this weekend, that it wouldn't make sense, that it wouldn't have helpful information, and that all the information you need would come next week. And now I actually think that this is perfect timing. My goal is in the next few minutes to give you an overview of the biggest topics happening in tariffs and trades to help you dissect high-level news that comes out this weekend and help you understand the implications for your business. Then, when the official announcements come out next week, we'll recap, get back together, talk about what actually happened and what that means. So there's been a ton in the news about trade and tariffs this week on a bunch of different topics. It starts with the new NAFTA agreement called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. That agreement has to be signed by all three countries this weekend before the new president of Mexico takes over. So those countries have been debating a signing ceremony and looking to find a time to all agree. President Trump in the United States wanted to have a large official signing ceremony, and Canada pushed back and said that they were not going to do a signing ceremony unless Canada was exempt from tariffs. So that's at a deadlock. But again, it has to get done this week before the administration changes in Mexico. So there's talks that the agreement will be signed this weekend at the G20 meeting in Argentina. So taking a step back just to make sure we're all on the same page, the G20 meeting is almost an entire week of meetings from the 20 largest economies in the world. And it ends on December 1st with a ministerial. So the leaders of those 20 countries are going to get together for a meeting of their own. All week, different officials, different groups within the governments are meeting. But the ministerial is when the highest levels, so the presidents or prime ministers, get together and meet and discuss things. So we are looking towards the G20 for a signing of the new NAFTA or the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. And if that agreement is not signed this week, we'll all be watching to see what happens. Basically, the NAFTA would stay in place. It hasn't been repealed yet, but none of the updates in the new agreement would go into effect. It'll also have implications for goodwill between those three countries. So this is something that we are anxiously watching moving into the weekend. That's the first topic. The second topic, no trade conversation these days can be without a conversation about U.S.-Chinese tariffs. Last week before Thanksgiving, there was a lot of positive rhetoric between the two countries. There has been more communication between the two countries in the last couple weeks than there has been all summer. So that's definitely positive that there's more talking. However, this week, there's been a couple hedges from the U.S. government. First, on Monday afternoon, President Trump said that he wasn't expecting a big win coming out of his meeting with President Xi on December 1st, again at that G20 meeting. Sorry, I want to take a step back and clarify. So for the last few weeks, secretaries, vice premiers have been meeting to discuss tariffs. This was all in anticipation of President Xi and President Trump meeting at the G20 meeting in Argentina as part of that G20 meeting. So they've been laying the ground, the ministers and secretaries have been laying the groundwork for the larger meeting. Now, there was some hiccups along that process. President Trump wanted a list of basically demands what the Chinese wanted out of this meeting, out of this agreement, and required that before he would meet with President Xi in Argentina. There was concerns that China wouldn't be interested in sharing that list. However, they have shared the list. And again, conversations did continue leading up to Thanksgiving. Then on Monday of this week, just a few days before this huge meeting that we've all been waiting for, President Trump threw, to quote some of the popular press, threw cold water on his expectations for this bilateral with President Xi, saying that he didn't know if an agreement was possible, that he expects to raise tariffs on January 1st, and that he still has a lot of options because there is another $206 billion worth of goods from China coming to the US that doesn't face tariffs yet. And he could impose a 10 to 25% tariff on those goods. And that could be as early as next week. So there's a lot going on there. Those are all the cards we knew that President Trump had, but he hadn't been as vocal about pointing it out recently as he did this week. Then on Tuesday, his national economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, who has definitely been a moderate on trade with China, came out and also had less positive comments than he had previously had, less optimism moving forward on what the possible outcomes this weekend are. And so from these conversations, I'd say that the global community is pretty nervous about what's going to happen this weekend. So what's possible this weekend? The best case scenario, honestly, is that the two sides come to an agreement and then no new tariffs go into place, old tariffs are repealed, and we start working on moving forward. Now, it takes years to work out agreements, and I can't expect, no one can expect that anything will be signed, sealed, and delivered at the G20 this weekend. The goal, I think the goal that most people have, and definitely the place that I see the most opportunity, is that this weekend the two sides meet, President Trump and President Xi meet. They discuss why they disagree, the topics that they disagree on, market access, intellectual property, the tariffs in general, and agree to keep talking. Now, that agreement to keep talking would set a path moving forward to resolve some of these issues, and it would hopefully include a signal that no additional tariffs are going to be imposed, and no tariffs that are already in effect will be increased. And then the third option is that there is no agreement. The discussions largely, I don't know that they break down, but there's just too big of a gulf between the two sides, and there isn't a clear path forward. That most likely would result in two actions from the US, both aimed at increasing pressure on China in hopes to change the conversation, hopes to force China to meet the US and agree to some of the terms the United States has laid out. And those two places that the US could put pressure on China is one. You may recall on September 24th, the United States imposed a 10% tariff on $200 billion worth of goods coming into the United States. That's over 5,000 different tariff codes. and that 10% tariff was an interim tariff until January 1st. That tariff would increase to 25%, or the president has the ability to raise that tariff to 25% on January 1st. So that's the first place that we're going to see or could see more pressure from the United States if an agreement is not agreed or a roadmap is not agreed to this weekend. The second one, which the president has also alluded to, is the United States imports roughly $500 billion worth of goods from China every year. Currently, there are tariffs on about half of that in this current wave of tariffs. That doesn't include tariffs that the United States had on Chinese goods prior to this year. So currently, about half of the goods entering the United States from China have faced additional tariffs in 2018. There are $267 billion worth of goods that come into the United States annually from China that have not seen an increase in their tariff rates. The president would then ask the United States Trade Representative, Lighthizer, to investigate putting tariffs on those additional goods. He's hinted that it could be at a rate of either 10% or 25% again. If the U.S. Trade Representative starts investigating that process, it takes approximately 2 months to go through public hearings, and we could expect additional tariffs as early as the beginning of February. So not giving companies a long time to adjust. Also, something to note that in the first round, it's not really the first round, it's really the third round, but that last round of those $200 billion worth of goods, there were a few exceptions. One of those most notably went to Apple. Apple products did not face that 10% tariff that the rest of the goods in that tranche faced. And the president on Monday, again, in that meeting with the Wall Street Journal, hinted at Apple not being exempt again. So that would mean that all the Apple products and the components, all the Apple products would face this 10% tariff. And you can quickly see how that would have a ripple effect through the dozens, hundreds of components that go into Apple products. And if you've been watching the stock market this week, you saw that Monday, after these comments into Tuesday, the Apple stock continued to slide with weak iPhone sales already a concern. Adding a 10 to 25% tariff on the phones or other Apple products themselves would have a serious impact on demand. And so that's really where we are on the current Chinese-U.S. tariffs. I didn't mention it in the beginning, but for those of you trying to follow along with all the different numbers and codes, most of the Chinese tariffs, that bulk of the 200 billion, all come from, it's called 301 tariffs, and basically that gives the United States the right to impose tariffs because of intellectual property theft. And so the goal of these tariffs is to change Chinese behaviors around intellectual property. The trade representative has investigated and feels that there's strong evidence to support that Chinese companies and the government are stealing intellectual property from foreign companies, are forcing technology transfer, and using intellectual property unfairly to the detriment of U.S. companies. So that really is the goal of imposing these tariffs, is to change those rules. Another thing that the president does talk about when he's talking about tariffs with China is the trade deficit. So those are the 2 points that that President Trump is looking to address as he moves forward with these 301 tariffs. And then this week, so there's now a new number, right? So we had the steel tariffs, which are national security. We have the intellectual property tariffs with China. And in February, the president asked the Department of Commerce to look into national security tariffs associated with autos. That report came out a few weeks ago, or was at least, I don't know that it's a public document, but it made its way to the president. He has until February to decide if the auto industry needs tariffs to be protected on the basis of national security. And this would have a major impact on mostly the United States allies. So if you think of large car companies are located in Europe, Japan, South Korea, a lot of our auto manufacturing is done across the NAFTA region or North America. And those tariffs would be imposed on cars in those countries or coming from all those countries, and it would not exempt our allies. So that news that the president is looking into those again more seriously, and even Reuters pointed out that they could make decisions as early as next week, is another point to watch, because while that might not affect your industry, I mean, it could. There are hundreds of thousands of products that go into cars. I think the average car I read has approximately 30,000 components. So the ripple effects of those tariffs would be huge. But the real concern, I would say, for a lot of US companies is retaliation. How will countries that now face import tariffs on autos because of these national security concerns respond? What products are they going to target in addition to the products that they've already targeted from the steel and aluminum tariffs earlier this year? And so these are the topics that I'm really watching, and I think that these are the topics on tariffs that hopefully we'll have a lot more information next week about. Some other points, you know, there's a debate about the impact, who's getting hurt the most, who's not getting hurt. You see that especially on the China side. You know, is the Chinese economy getting more damaged by the tariffs and therefore they are going to come around? Or is it the US that's getting, you know, harmed and this needs to be resolved sooner? Personally, I don't think anybody wins from tariffs. I think there's going to be a lot more damage than there is good on either side. Not that I don't disagree with some of the arguments on intellectual property. There's a lot of damage being done. And numbers today showed that tariffs collected by Customs and Border Patrol on these tariffs reached $4.4 billion in August and September. And those are taxes that Americans are paying to import goods that have tariffs. And that number is a record high. And the tariffs that we've seen imposed so far are relatively low. You have the steel and aluminum tariffs, which are it's not that they're insignificant, but compared to all goods from China and all auto tariffs, they're quite small. And the tariffs that are currently imposed on goods from China, you have about $60 billion worth of goods that are facing a 25% tariff. But that 200 billion tranche is still only at 10%. So it's going to more than double in January if the tariff is raised. And that doesn't include the next 260 billion. So the impact that we've seen so far, a lot of people question how severe it is, whether it's isolated, whether the US economy can withstand it, and what to do moving forward. But the numbers are getting a lot bigger moving into the next tranches. And that's where companies really need to be concerned and really need to be monitoring this situation. And that's really where I think that companies have the best opportunity. You know, if you haven't been monitoring, if it hasn't affected you up until now, it's hard to find a single product that's not going to be affected moving forward. Whether you're losing markets because of counter tariffs, whether your costs are going up because your inputs are going up on products that you import, you know, it's just companies are affected in every direction, and looking into that, understanding how this is affecting you, preparing your documents better for import. These are all critical steps that companies have to take. And one of the questions that I've been asked a lot this week, I think it's because we're going into the Christmas season where there's a lot of purchasing coupled with, you know, potential new tariffs in January and February. You know, what impact is this having, or will this have on consumers? And prices are going up. Every company that I've talked to is trying to figure out ways to minimize the impact on their customers, how to keep those prices down, how to change their supply chains to minimize costs. But across the board, a 10 to 25% increase just isn't something that most companies can absorb. And some of that cost will be passed on to consumers. And there was a study that came out either yesterday, I know I talked about it this morning on Twitter, but a study that came out from, it was a Koch Foundation, funded study done by Impact, I believe. And they found that the average household will see a $2,400 increase in the costs associated with all of these tariffs. So it's not insignificant. It will have an impact. And depending on the product, it's going to impact it in different ways. We see that, you know, a lot of the apparel companies are concerned. They already face a huge percentage of the tariffs. And if hats, you know, get a 25% higher tariff, how many people are going to buy hats? I mean, so you know, you're going to see some buying behaviors change. And in other places, you might see substitutes, people looking for either domestic products or products from countries that don't have tariffs. And those supply chains are going to adjust. So, you know, I really think that there's a lot of movement going forward. I think that this weekend is going to be very interesting for all of us, no matter what countries you do business with. And, you know, this, as the year slowed down, I know companies want to slow down, employees want to slow down, everybody's excited about the holidays. But, you know, this is not the time to have your head in the sand. This is the time to really be watching what's happening every day and figuring out how to move forward. Maybe you just come up with the plans and don't implement them until next year, but there's a lot of breadcrumbs leading to more tariffs and bigger tariffs than we've seen so far. And I'm working with my clients to be aware of these, prepare for them, figure out the impact, and figure out solutions. And I hope that you're starting to do that as well. And if you would like to talk with me about your specific company, I'd be happy to go into details and talk about, you know, which tariffs, which countries, so we can start developing your detailed plan, because that's definitely honestly the best way forward. In some of my, newsletters the last few weeks, I've pointed to statistics about how few companies are really taking the tariff seriously. And if you compare that with the cost of the companies that are already being impacted, you can see that, it's dramatic, and not taking the steps forward really could have a negative impact on your business. So I appreciate you joining me today. My email is either, if you're watching this on the Stratagerm website, you should be able to find the contact me. If you're watching it on YouTube, I'll include my contact information in the video notes, but I really look forward to hearing from you and talking with everyone online all weekend. It's going to be one of the most interesting weekends in international trade in a long time. Again, you've got a potential signing, the deadline actually on the signing of the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement. You've got a President Trump, President Xi meeting, which would decide or at least give us a direction forward on US-Chinese tariffs. And then you've got rumors of auto tariffs coming out in the near future. So stay tuned. Feel free to reach out to me all this weekend. I just spent 26 minutes talking about this, so I love talking about this, and I can't wait to hear from you. Thank you so much.